Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Sirhan on X on this 1st of October of the calendar year 2025, as we come to you live from Cincinnati, Ohio, in the United States of America. Here's someone who had themselves a wonderful day today. October is finally here. Took a little bit to get here. Crazy weather up and down, especially a lot of the Indian summer that just came out of the blue. But here we are, and it is the 1st of October, and hopefully we can finally get some fall weather over here, because we've had still humid weather over here. Tonight is about a golden air night that took place overseas. And I call this my super show because it's going to be one of the many ones I have from now to the end of the year. I relive golden nights, and this one basically fits the bill for what took place 50 years ago tonight. It was the conclusion of probably the historic rivalry in pop culture history, not just boxing, not just sports, but in all of pop culture. Because when you think about rivalries, you don't get more bigger, more talked about than Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier. And it was 50 years ago tonight over in the Philippines that rivalry ended in one of the more brutal, terrific, wild nights maybe ever. And the rivalry, I'll touch on that as we go along. Edgy, filled with a lot of things, theatrics, among many others, good, bad, pretty, and ugly. And this was the captivation of all of it. And basically, I'm going to talk about how we got to this point, the event, and what happened afterward, and its place in history. Because when you talk about rivalries, this is like the gold standard and one of the pillars when you talk about rivalries. How do we get to this point? Well, we know how it started way back in the amateurs. Back in we talk about Muhammad Ali winning the gold medal in 1960, and a little factoid that few people know about: Joe Frazier won the gold medal 4 years later in Tokyo in 1964. He was a fill-in for the guy that beat him, being Buster Mathis Sr., because Sr. pulled out because of a hand injury, but before the Olympics started, and Frazier took his place. And Frazier was the one that won this gold medal in 1964. That's one thing nobody talks about. So you probably see a lot of this started in the amateurs. And when Frazier was on the march to winning the gold medal in 64, shortly thereafter, Ali began his mark, then known as Cassius Clay. And basically, before Frazier won the gold medal, it was on the night of February 25th, 1964, we had the greatest upset in sports history at the time, when Muhammad Ali, then known as Cassius Clay, stunned the invincible and intimidating Sonny Liston, making him quitting on the stool to become the heavyweight champion of the world as an 8-1 underdog. And Clay, at the time, had his coming out party, his finest hour. We know what he said after that fight: "I'm pretty, I'm a bad man, I shook up the world." And he certainly did as the 8-1 underdog. As that was going on, now enter Joe Frazier, who began his professional career. And as he was coming along, Ali was still the champion of the world. It was basically on top. But we know what happened a few years later with Muhammad Ali, with his views. I'm not going to use the platform to discuss it. Those are the fight game. I'm sure you guys know what they were. And he was stripped of the heavyweight championship. And it was shortly thereafter, Joe Frazier fought Jimmy Ellis for the vacant championship. He won the title with a perfectly placed left hook that sent Ellis down and out for the count in the second round, and he became the heavyweight champion. Of course, nobody wanted to accept him as a heavyweight champ for the obvious reasons. And when we talk about what happened to Muhammad Ali at that time, one of the guys that went to bat for Muhammad Ali to get him back in the ring was actually Joe Frazier. that's one thing nobody talks about. Joe Frazier was one of the ones I thought, like a lot of people did at the time, it wasn't necessarily a correct move. And Frazier basically said he should be fighting because everyone knows at the time the buildup was starting to build for Ali-Frazier, especially after he demolished basically everyone. And of course, the end came with the Phantom Punch against Sonny Liston. And Frazier started to make his mark because Frazier knows for that championship to have meant something, he wanted Ali in the ring. Everyone knows that because if you want to be accepted as a champ, you need to beat the champ. And remember, Ali didn't lose the title in the ring at the time. He lost it because of reasons. I mean, you guys know the reasons. I won't discuss it on my platform. So in 1970, that comes around. Ali reapplies for the license, and he gets it back. And now he targets Joe Frazier. After a couple fights, the build-up started to begin. And even though Joe Frazier stood up for Muhammad Ali during time of Ali's exile, Muhammad Ali didn't accept Joe Frazier as a heavyweight champ, started spewing the insults, among many other things, calling him names, whatever the reasons were. I mean, still nobody knows at the time. It's still somewhat of a mystery, given how Frazier went to bat for him during the process that got him stripped of the title and was put in exile. And when that began, it rubbed off Joe Frazier the wrong way. And now the rivalry was starting outside of the ring. And they were starting to go at it verbally. And even at times during the buildup, you had a feeling something bad was almost about to happen simply because it wasn't just insults. Lines were nearly crossed, and they were nearly crossed intentionally both ways. And if the way society is today, if that stuff took place today, you know something wild was going to take place. That's how edgy this rivalry between these two combatants started. And we're not talking about the fact that it wasn't anything about competitive or anything about boxing. It went to personal lines. Sensitive words were used, especially from the Muhammad Ali side aimed at Joe Frazier. We know what those words are, especially those in that community. But when you talk about the ego of Ali and the fact that this was what he wanted moving forward, that's what we started to get. And now it spun off to an intense buildup for what was at that called the fight of the century, which is set for March 8th, 1971 at Madison Square Garden. Joe Frazier defending the title against Muhammad Ali. And in this particular fight, it was 15 thrilling rounds where Ali started out well. Frazier came back. Then Ali came back on his own. But Frazier closed the fight strong, especially when you consider the trademark left hook that floored Ali in the 15th round with minutes to go, which essentially sealed it. And basically was the biggest win of Joe Frazier's career. And it was not only did those words insult Joe Frazier that came out of Muhammad Ali's mouth, basically, not only it got to a point to where Joe Frazier felt betrayed personally because Frazier went to bat for Muhammad Ali for everything that took place that got Ali stripped of the heavyweight championship. And that was where the feuds to where Ali and Frazier really started to kick off. And looks like at that point, we might not get a rematch because it was shortly thereafter, both guys went their separate ways. But in the middle of that, here comes a young upstart from Houston, Texas, named Big George Foreman. And we talk about the gold medals from Ali in 1960, Frazier in 1964. The 1968 Olympic gold medalist in the Mexican Games was George Foreman. The power punching machine, who basically was, at that point, was perceptive-wise, was the baddest thing since Sonny Liston. Now, he was coming up through the ranks, and now he was the number one contender for Joe Frazier's heavyweight championship. And at that point, a chance of an Ali-Frazier rematch was sort of paused at the time because here comes Foreman steamrolling the competition. And we get Foreman-Frazier of January 22nd, 1973 at Kingston, Jamaica. We know the story of what happened in this one. Frazier still living high after beating Ali in 71, pegged as basically a 4-1 favorite. Basically goes to Kingston, Jamaica, and just gets the brakes beaten off of him, floored 6 times in 5 minutes. And Foreman is carried out of the ring at Kingston, Jamaica as the heavyweight champion of the world. Excuse me. And at that point, the Frazier, if Ali, a chance of a rematch, wasn't even thought of, because now George Foreman was at the apex, and now he was the man, and everything for a Frazier-Ali rematch looked like it was going to be blown up. But shortly after that fight, and after a couple comeback wins, we would have the rematch of Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier at Madison Square Garden. And the build-up for this really intensified and almost really got out of control. Because in the ABC studio, fight followers know what this is. Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier were sitting next to Howard Cosell, and they were still spitting insults. And Joe Frazier stood up and physically challenged Muhammad Ali in the studio, and a near altercation broke to where camps of both fighters had to separate the two, to where at that point it almost was as if the fight was about to be called off, because they had to be separated in the middle of a scuffle, because Frazier still stinging from some of the words Ali used directed at Joe Frazier. And there were some words that really stung Joe Frazier. He almost took it out of Muhammad Ali in that studio. Luckily, the camps for both fighters pulled the fighters apart. No further damage or injury was done. And when you talk about the intense, how this rivalry started to get intense, this is probably the apex of it. Because when you think about, we can talk about rivalries all we want. This was a genuine rivalry with genuine hatred for both Frazier and Ali. And the key word being genuine, because insults were thrown all over the place, slurs were thrown all over the place, and as a result, it boiled to this point. And I mean boiled. And we talk about the rematch that took place on January 28th, 1974 at the famed Madison Square Garden, where the first fight took place. This time around, Muhammad Ali just gave Joe Frazier basically the equivalent of a boxing lesson. It was a solid fight, not as great as the first one, but it was a good fight both ways. But Ali was head and shoulders above the rest. He won the unanimous decision, won a North American title. It was now pegged as the contender for the baddest man at the time, Big George Foreman. And we know what happened. We talk about this buildup. Now, Ali's focus turned to George Foreman and to get back what he thought was rightfully his, the heavyweight championship of the world, the one that was stripped from him for reasons we know what those are. And the buildup for Ali Foreman was basically pegged to be a Foreman showcase, because Ali did feeling was Foreman was just the baddest man on the planet after plowing Joe Frazier, Jose Roman, and Ken Norton. He was a sizable favorite in front of a globalized audience in Kinshasa, Zaire, to where many thought he was going to do the same thing to Muhammad Ali. So now we have Ali Foreman of October 30th, 1974, and Ali doing like he did to Sonny Liston before, started to taunt George Foreman, and basically George Foreman tried to everything he could to not engage in the verbal and the taunts of Ali as the buildup was beginning. But we talk about this, Muhammad Ali was just driven like he was 10 years before this when he shocked Sonny Liston to shock the world again. And on that night of October 30th, 1974 in Kinshasa, Zaire, he did just that. Used the strategic rope-a-dope strategy to let George Foreman just punch himself out. And by the end of the 8th round, the combination that floored Foreman, that kept him down and out for the count. And as Foreman was down and out for the count, Ali was marching around the ring with his hands in the air. And that was how we had the new heavyweight champion of the world. And in a stunner, Muhammad Ali, for the second time in his career, regains a heavyweight championship. And basically, he said after the fight, I told you I was going to beat Sonny Liston and shock the world. I did it. I told you I was going to beat George Foreman and shock the world. I did it. I'm the master of shock. Don't ever doubt me again. And while that's going on, Frazier's trying to reestablish himself to try and get another shot of the title. Because when you think about what happened to him on January 22nd, 1973, to Foreman, he got one of those beatings that makes you wonder if he was going to ever be the same again. Because Foreman laid the lumber to Joe Frazier. And people thought because of how he laid the lumber to Joe Frazier, he was going to do the same to Muhammad Ali. It didn't happen. That's why they say styles make fights, and that's how you had it. And so after a couple of fights down the line with those two fighters, we get what took place 50 years ago tonight at the Quezon City in the Philippines, the Thrilla in Manila, the trilogy, the rivalry that come to an end, Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier. And once again, for you American morons in the American moronic boxing community, because we have a lot of American morons in the boxing community, didn't matter where the fight took place. Muhammad Ali was from Louisville, Kentucky. Joe Frazier, although technically from Philadelphia, actually was born in Beaumont, South Carolina. Two American fighters. Where did this fight take place? The Philippines, not in the States. So the American morons could just quit it with where the fights take place. But we talk about this global event. This one, you don't have to do much building up because all the taunts they had in the first two fights were building up. And basically, when they put this together, it was essentially a case of, let's put this thing to bed. Let's close a rivalry. Whoever wins a rubber match wins a rivalry. And Muhammad Ali just kept going. And of course, he brings up an artificial gorilla and was just pounding the gorilla. And it was him that coined that phrase, Thrilla in Manila. I'm going to get the killer and the thriller when I get the killer in Manila. And he has the gorilla toy in his hand, speed batting it, and basically saying, come on, gorilla, we in Manila. And angling that at Joe Frazier, still throwing all kinds of insults to get to the face of Joe Frazier and try and get him riled up. And Joe Frazier, per usual, still not taking kindly to anything Muhammad Ali said. And that's basically the story of this rivalry. And we talk about pure hatred, rivalries, which I'll touch on at the end of the show. This was pure, and the words that came out of both guys' mouths toward one another makes you wonder why. Makes you wonder how, at times, they showed constraint, because there were lines that were crossed. I mean, and hard and intentionally, for whatever reason. Who knows? We talk about what took place in the Philippines 50 years ago today. In the front of a massive crowd, over 100 billion views on closed circuit television, and this fight was on a network that just began the process called HBO. Back then, they call it HBO boxing. It was home box office boxing because that's what it was. They're called by the great Don Dumphy, arguably the greatest play-by-play commentator in boxing history. And in front of a packed house, we finally had the Thrilla in Manila, the fight that everyone wanted to see. And during the stare downs, they were taunting one another still during referees' instructions. Even the referee of that fight, Carlos Padilla, said, Ali told him to his face, you no longer have it. And Frazier responded to saying, we'll see. And now the fight finally began. And in the first 4 rounds, it seemed like Ali wanted to do more than just box a guy, because we know what he was known for. He wanted to get Frazier out of there early, start to step up his aggression a little bit and control the fight, especially keeping at bay with the jabs and the right hands, because we know what Frazier likes to do, the Philly style, bob and weave, come over the top with the left hook. Ali did all he could to keep Frazier at bay and actually control the first few rounds of this fight. But we talk about what made this the Thrilla in Manila, as Ali was controlling the fight, slowly but gradually, Frazier started to seize momentum. And the third, fourth, and fifth rounds, as Ali was laying on the ropes, Frazier started to find success. And how you find success against a guy who's laying on the ropes? You go to the guy's body. And Joe Frazier was as great as anyone in boxing history going to the body, especially with a left hook to the liver. He found Ali's liver as the fight was going on. And as the rounds were starting to come on, it looked like the body punching of Frazier slowly started to catch up. And as a result, Ali spent a lot of time on the ropes. If you went, his trainer, Angelo Dundee, basically told him, don't lean on the ropes. Get over there. Get out of there. As if he was trying to re-implement the rope-a-dope strategy that he used to beat George Foreman, thinking that it was going to work against Joe Frazier. Joe Frazier basically saw what happened on that night and wouldn't let it happen. So what does he do? He bobs and weaves, goes through and finds ways to sex to the body. And he started finding home as a fight was going on with that vicious left hook that has been Joe Frazier's bread and butter throughout his entire career. When you talk about signature punches, especially for the Philadelphia fighters, it's a left hook. Arguably the greatest left hook in heavyweight history was Joe Frazier's. And he was starting to find success with it as Ali was pinned against the ropes. And now they're starting to get exchanges. And we talk about this. These two guys started to step up, and now we had heated exchanges between both fighters. As Frazier was coming on trying to steal the momentum, Ali was doing all he can to match him punch for punch. And now we had the brutal fight that everyone was expecting, and everything started to play out the way it was. As the middle rounds and the later rounds started to come on, looked like Frazier finally got to Ali, had him slowly wearing down. But one thing people don't talk about with Muhammad Ali, you can say a lot of things, but one thing he has nobody talks about, the heart. And he had a heart as big as everyone, and he showed it because when Frazier was coming on, he went deep, he went to the well, and started to match Frazier punch for punch. And as that was coming on, as Frazier was beginning to tire him out, Ali found a way to preserve himself. And as rounds 9 through 12 started to come along, he found a bit of a second win. And was basically a case of Ali finding himself. And now Frazier, who was getting momentum, started to take a beating a little bit. His mouth was bloodied. Both eyes were swollen. But so too was Muhammad Ali's from what happened at the punches he took from Joe Frazier. And we talk about this. Muhammad Ali started to seize control, even though Frazier was basically still in it. But Ali started to separate himself from Frazier because the beating that he started administering to Frazier's face started to show. And at the end, at the 13th and 14th rounds came around, the beating was starting to get worse. Frazier's face was basically a grotesque mask, among many other things. But Muhammad Ali wasn't necessarily the prettiest thing either. He was starting to get a beating. It was revealed during the fight. He told Angelo Dundee, "This is the closest thing to death that I ever faced." Because Frazier was laying it to Ali. While he was laying it to Ali was laying it to Frazier. And now we had the ferocious exchanges that they had in their first fight, March 8th, 1971, reliving itself 3.5 years later over there in the Philippines. But then came the moment as the 14th round came to an end, and Ali basically having this fight essentially won. And we got drama all over the place. It was wondering, will they have a 15th round? The answer was no. The moment in the corner of Joe Frazier and his trainer, Eddie Futch, was basically the case of Eddie Futch saving Joe Frazier from himself. Because the beating was starting to be administered, and basically Eddie Futch told Joe Frazier casually, "I'm going to stop it." And Frazier implored Eddie, saying, "Don't do this to me." But Futch basically said, "You couldn't see," which both of Frazier's eyes were swollen shut, and it was a grotesque mask. And Frazier saying, "I want him," but Eddie Futch basically said, You were fantastic tonight," which Joe Frazier was in defeat. And he was fantastic, no doubt about it. But Eddie Futch basically said, "Everybody knows you were great, but let's move on to another day." And it was at that point, the greatest rivalry in boxing history, arguably the greatest rivalry in sports history, and maybe in all of pop culture, came to an end as Joe Frazier's trainer, Eddie Futch, threw in the towel, and Muhammad Ali left arguably the greatest fight and probably the most brutal fight in boxing history with a win, closing out the rivalry against Joe Frazier 2-1. There's also this myth that it's been debunked every single which way possible, but nobody knows how true it was. That as Eddie Futch was telling Frazier he was going to stop it, Angel Dundee was telling Ali he was going to stop it. Okay, that's a myth that has been debunked every which way possible. Nobody knows years later whether it was actually true or not. But we were not going to have a 15th round because both guys toyed with death. We talk about the heavy punches and the heavy lumber. These two landed and took. It's shown in the fighters' faces. I mean, we look at what Frazier's face. I mean, both of his eyes were swollen shut. His mouth was grotesquely covered in blood. And Ali's face was starting to get beat up, especially in the middle rounds when Frazier started to come on and had Ali pinned against the ropes. And Ali was basically laying on the ropes, and Angel Dundee was telling him, get out of there. But as Frazier was starting to deliver the beating, Ali stepped up. He delivered the same beating to Frazier. And we talk about what took place on this night. As brutal as combat sports is, and we know how brutal it can be, this was widely regarded as the most brutal fight in the history of all combat sports because it was heavy lumber both ways. I mean, these were heavy. We're talking about heavyweights here, over 220 plus pounds, and they were laying lumber to one another. And Joe Frazier started to feel the rest of that particular fight as a fight was going on because Ali found himself after taking off in the middle rounds, and so Joe Frazier gained the momentum. So many shifts of momentum, so many twists and turns, so much climax and drama on this particular night to close up maybe the most climactic rivalry maybe in sports and pop culture history. And that's what we had here. It couldn't have been any other way when you talk about Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier, because that's what it was. We talk about fighters today, how they like to play it safe. These two guys didn't want to play it safe. They went after it. A lot of fighters today could learn from these two about having the drive and determination to be great, because that's what these two guys had. And that's what they did in the Philippines in front of a crowded house. Over 100 plus, it was estimated as much as over 100 billion views on all the closed circuit networks. And of course, it's played on at HBO Boxing. At the time, it was called Home Box Office Boxing, which was later replayed on ABC's Wide World of Sports. And we talk about just how recognized this event was. The numbers speak for itself. And all you have to do is mention Thrilla in Manila, and that's all you have to say. Because that's what Ali-Frazier 3 was. And basically, it was a culmination of everything that built up in and out of the ring between these two guys, going back to their first fight of March 8th, 1971, to the studio altercation, to the rematch, to after Ali regained the title from George Foreman. To this point, it built up. It was intense. It was basically pure dislike and pure hatred between two combatants. And basically, neither guy embraced after the fight. It was basically a case of two fighters who basically just said, good fight, and left it. And it was a rivalry that still continued because the words for the longest time that came out of Ali's mouth aimed at Joe Frazier stung him. And that's why we had what we had. And that we talk about this particular fight and this particular trilogy. It's just a boxing history. Let's start with that to begin with. I mean, we had some great ones, obviously. I mean, of course, the one that spun off 20 years later was the Evander Holyfield-Riddick Bowe trilogy, just like Ali-Frazier, although more subdued because there was no hatred. But in terms of in-ring competition, Holyfield-Bowe mirrored Ali-Frazier, because we look at the third fight of Holyfield-Bowe, it was like the third fight of Ali-Frazier. The most brutal of the three fights, where both guys just laid heavy punches on one another, and it was basically a beating all the way around for both guys. It was exactly that exact same thing. And so Holyfield-Bowe, probably the closest thing to Ali-Frazier. We talk about Ali-Frazier. Right behind Ali-Frazier was Muhammad Ali and Ken Norton. Every bit as great as Ali-Frazier, but maybe not that high, because Ali-Frazier had a bunch of other things that made that rivalry the gold standard. But Muhammad Ali, Ken Norton was not far behind. We consider how Ken Norton won the fight, having broke Ali's jaw. A second fight where Ali went to the well and won the last few rounds to steal that one. And of course, the third fight where everyone's still wondering how Muhammad Ali got the decision. So Ali Norton, that trilogy, not far behind from Ali-Frazier. It was certainly a terrific one. You got Ray Leonard and a couple of fighters he had, Thomas Hearns and Roberto Duran. I mean, ultimate supremacy at the welterweight division in the early '80s. Especially talking about he fought Duran and Hearns basically back to back from the view of Sugar Ray Leonard. We're not talking about Leonard's place in welterweight history without those two fights. And remember, Roberto Duran beat Sugar Ray Leonard in Montreal 5 months before Leonard got his title back in No Mas. So Leonard against Duran was a rivalry. So same with Leonard and Hearns. Although the second fight with Hearns was 7 years past his expiration date, but the buildup for Leonard Hearns 1 was quite like none other because Leonard Hearns 1 had the same kind of buildup and anticipation as Ali-Frazier 1 did 10 years before it. So Leonard Hearns is also in that conversation. Go a little more modern, Eric Morales and Marco Antonio Barrera, two standout Mexican fighters in the post-Julio Cesar Chavez and Ricardo Lopez era. Wanted to see who was the man during that time. Barrera won that 2-1, albeit how they got to that point was a little weird. And their rivalry for the Mexican community mirrored Ali-Frazier because there were insults both ways. Actually, in the second fight, a sucker punch was thrown before Barrera Morales too. That rivalry was every bit as close as and intense as Ali-Frazier. So Barrera Morales is one. Israel Vasquez versus Rafael Marquez. You want to talk about face first, clash you upside the head, and just bash your face inside out. That was an Israel Vasquez Rafael Marquez rivalry. Manny Pacquiao versus Juan Manuel Marquez. I mean, we know how that dragged out. Granted, the end was the fourth fight with the perfectly placed right hand that has Manny Pacquiao seeing stars. Pacquiao Marquez was also a rivalry. Then we go back a little bit in time. Before the hated rivalry of Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier, there was a hated rivalry of Willie Pep and Sandy Sadler, where in and out of the ring, just like Ali Frazier, lines were crossed, especially in the ring, where fouls were committed both ways all the way around. And basically, at one point, the commission put both fighters on timeout for the longest time. Willie Pep and Sandy Sadler was every bit as hotly contested as Ali Frazier, and lines were crossed and touched on that one also. Barney Ross versus Jimmy McLaurin. Well, Ross is a top 25 all-time great. Jimmy McLaurin, an underrated all-time great. They had a great trilogy in the middle there, the late 30s, where it was basically they bounced a lightweight title back and forth till Ross took care of business in the third fight. It showed why he's an all-time great. Ross McNorland was one of them. Tony Zale versus Rocky Graziano. And we talk about face first, bash you upside the head till somebody hits the floor type rivalries. That's what Zale Graziano was. First fight, as I said the other night, Graziano had the fight under control to the perfectly placed left hook that sent him down and out. Graziano will regain the middleweight title a year later, and the year after that, Zale regains the title. The 1946, 47, and 48 fights of the year, the three fights between Tony Zale and Rocky Graziano. That's in that conversation. Maybe the more real terrific heavyweight rivalry before Ali-Frazier, Floyd Patterson and Ignacio Johansson. The first, basically, bodies hit the floor, the epitome of what heavyweight boxing was. Basically, both fights, both guys hit the floor all over the place. Of course, Johansson winning the first time, Patterson coming back to winning those two. That's a heavyweight boxing rivalry that probably mirrors Ali-Frazier, because with that fight, bodies hit the floor, and that was before Ali-Frazier came around. And Patterson and Johansson delivered the goods. So those are some of the ones in the boxing fraternity, especially we talk about the trilogies, because that's what a lot of those were. Because with the exception of Leonard Duran, because Leonard Duran 3 basically was past its expiration date. Let's get that out of the way. I don't even mention Leonard Duran 3. When we talk about some of the trilogies, especially to Ali-Frazier, Ali Norton, Holyfield Bowe, Barrera Morales, Zale Graziano, Patterson Johansson, and Pep Sadler. Those were what boxing rivalries were and trilogies were. And I said all along, it's a case of when two fighters get in that ring and they're made for one another, and when the styles clash, you got excitement. That's what those were. A boatload of others to boot. You can talk about Benny Perrette versus Emil Griffith. That was another one. And of course, as I said, Barney Ross versus Jimmy McLaurin. And Ross was as good as anyone. Jimmy McLaurin was pretty good also, but Ross was an all-time great. And that showed in the third of that trilogy. Of course, we go more other rivalries that had more than 3 fights. Ezra Charles and Jersey Joe Walcott, after Joe Louis retired, split their 4 fight series. That was a pretty darn good one, also, uh, among many others. I said Pacquiao Marquez. They had a 4 fight series that from 2004 to the end of 2012. We know how that entitled, which strung out a little too long, but we know politics got in the way of it, and that's why that strung out the way it did. Eric Morales versus Manny Pacquiao was actually a decent one. We consider the wild circumstances of their first fight under weird circumstances. Pacquiao, of course, coming back to obliterate Morales in the second and third fight, where Eric Morales quit in the third fight. And that was basically how rivalries are made in the sport of boxing, among many others. Sugar Ray Robinson and Jake LaMotta. Of course, LaMotta won the first fight, but Robinson just won the rest. And of course, we know about the St. Valentine's Day massacre, where LaMotta just had zero answers for the greatest fighter pound for pound of all time. We talk about rivalries and trilogies in the sport of boxing. That is what it was. And the gold standard was, and always will be Ali-Frazier. Nothing will ever come close to it, no matter how hard you try. Because they had everything on the line. Lines were crossed. It basically crossed so bad to where a couple times we thought this trilogy wouldn't even go that far, because we talk about that studio altercation in their second fight. It got pretty nasty. And that's how rivalries were. Now you talk about the context of sports rivalries, and there's a boatload of this. I could quite an hour of this if I really want to, because there's a lot of them. Well, start maybe almost like the Ali-Frazier of the NBA rivalries, the '80s Lakers versus Celtics of the teams, and of course Magic Johnson versus Larry Bird. We're not talking about the NBA today without that rivalry with the Lakers and the Celtics and Magic and Larry, because that was the gold standard, and that was when the NBA started to become a mainstream event across all the television networks. And as the Bird Magic rivalry was starting to heat up and get hot, especially with Lakers and the Celtics, the NBA started to take off, and it was a real golden time for the NBA, especially when you consider everything that took place between the two teams, all the trash talking, the flagrant foul by Kevin McHale on Kurt Rambis, among many others, the historical moments all over the place, calling Magic Johnson Tragic Johnson at one point, to where they bounced back and obliterated the Celtics, the baby sky hook. That was a memorable rivalry. We talk about that time. Of course, the Pistons and the Bulls, the Jordan rules. Of course, Michael needed to get to for Michael Jordan to get to the level he needed to beat Detroit. Finally got to him in '91. That was after Detroit eliminated Michael's Bulls in previous 2 seasons. That's a rivalry. We talk about the NBA. Baseball, we know the kingpin of them all, the Yankees and the Red Sox. Going back to the whole shebang with Babe Ruth, the curse of Babe Ruth, till that was broken in 2004, when the Yankees had that series under control to get reverse swept. That rivalry still continues. Granted, that's not what it was before then, because after the whole thing with Babe Ruth, it was intense bad blood, basically Ali-Frazier-esque, because it was edgy when we talk about the two teams and the uniforms they wore, because whenever you saw Yankees and Red Sox wear uniforms, they see one another, they wanted to go at it. And basically, it was real edgy for the longest time. And you talk about historical moments that took place during that rivalry, especially in 2003 when Aaron Boone hit the walk-off to eliminate Boston. Only have Boston come back in 2004 to win that series on a reverse sweep. Still an intense rivalry, it'll always be, but not as intense as it was for that 100-year period, because for the longest time, the perception was Boston will never win a World Series because of the Babe Ruth situation. And they always own as the curse of the Bambino, until Boston eradicated that in 2004 when they won it all. So that was a rivalry. Of course, we talk about some of the rivalries out west, the Dodgers, the Giants, the Padres, those 3 West teams, they've always had rivalries. For a minute over here in Cincinnati, the Reds and the Cardinals, always going to be a rivalry. And of course, the apex was in 2010, where just as you walk into the stadium, they were having a get-together to see who had a better-looking wife, and they were fighting one another over it. So that's more of the baseball part. NFL always has their rivalries. I mean, it's always going to be that way forever. The AFC, the NFC North, when we talk about Green Bay and Chicago, it's historic. It's always well chronicled. Green Bay and Dallas. Every year, it seemed like when you talk about NFC supremacy, they collide for the top of the NFC, especially when we talk about the early 90s with Brett Favre and Troy Aikman for the respective teams just to get over the hump. That was a rivalry. Of course, it was always for the longest time. Would Green Bay get over the hump against Dallas? Took them a little bit, but they eventually did. That's what led them to the Super Bowl in 96. But before then, it was, of course, a Dallas dynasty. And also in there was the Cowboys and the 49ers, especially when we talk about after the Joe Montana thing just died out and Steve Young took over against the dynasty of the Dallas Cowboys who went back-to-back. Question was, could San Fran get over the hump after the Joe Montana era ended? And they finally did in 95. That was a rivalry for that 3-year period. Of course, the NFC East battles. You talk about the Eagles, the Giants, Washington, and the Cowboys. When they go at it, it's old school smash mouth football, and there's always something in the rivalry. Of course, we saw what happened week 1 where Jalen Carter spit in the face of Dak Prescott. Tells you everything about those NFC East rivalries. In the early 2000s, actually more like mid-2000s, the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Baltimore Ravens. AFC supremacy, both in the same division. And let me remind you, also in there was the Tennessee Titans. Before they went to the AFC South, they were part of the AFC Central with Baltimore and Pittsburgh. And when those 3 teams went at it, it was old school, wacky, upside the head type football. And we talk about the Pittsburgh-Baltimore rivalry. It was the apex of who was going to be the crown of the AFC. And this is in the middle of another rivalry. Tom Brady versus Peyton Manning, Patriots and Colts. Eventually the Patriots and the Broncos as Peyton Manning moved. That was another rivalry that belongs in that conversation. You talk about tennis rivalries, which we have a lot of. We talk about individual ones, a lot of great ones here. Martina Navratilova and Chris Everett. Of course, Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal. That's a terrific rivalry. Among many others. For the longest time, John McEnroe and Jimmy Connors was one because we know the contrast of personalities over there. Pete Sampras versus Andre Agassi. Monica Seles versus Steffi Graf. Tennis had their own share of rivalries, especially when we talk about individuals. Some of the UFC, obviously, we talk about the light heavyweight division, which was sizzling for the longest time in the UFC. Tito Ortiz, Ken Shamrock, Chuck Liddell. I mean, the Liddell-Ortiz rivalry was chronicled. Randy Couture, Rashad Evans, Rampage Jackson, among many others. So they had their rivalries, especially in the light heavyweight division of the UFC. A lot of good ones there. We talk about more individual rivalries in the NFL. Brady Manning, obviously, is going to be the gold standard in that regard in terms of quarterbacks. Maybe one today, Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes. That's also a rivalry. We talk about the defensive end rivalry between T.J. Watt and Myles Garrett that has both fan bases all up in arms over their guy. That's also a rivalry. Go back to Troy Aikman versus Steve Young. Troy Aikman versus Brett Favre. Steve Young versus Brett Favre. Those quarterback rivalries. Of course, a comparison of the 83 draft. We talk about Dan Marino, Jim Kelly, and John Elway. Who was a better quarterback of those 3 in that particular draft? Everyone has an opinion on those. That's always a rivalry. And we talk about some of the more in the basketball front. Garnett versus Duncan in the 2000s. Kobe versus Shaq internally, because we know how that rivalry was. And the Lakers, when they with the three-peat, found a way to cement that rivalry. And of course, college sports has their own share of rivalries. Doesn't matter who's playing on that teams, or is when you wear the uniform and you start to see wild stuff. Most notably, Ohio State and Michigan. Apex was last year with a fight after the game on the flag planting incident. Alabama, Auburn, USC, Notre Dame, USC, UCLA, Georgia, Alabama, and the list goes on. I could buy about 5,000 other sports rivalries I could want to individually and team-wise. But the apex of rivalries is always going to be Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier. Because we talk about the word rivalry, that's like one of the first rivalries that comes through everybody's mind when you mention historic rivalry. And that's what this was. At the highest level and at its apex. We talk about 2 guys that were made for one another, despite all the things that was said, all the things that was done in and out of the ring. It's still the greatest rivalry of all time. And even Muhammad Ali said at one point, if I need to go to war with someone, I'm taking Joe Frazier with me. Probably the ultimate compliment you could probably say. But we talk about the words that Ali used to aim at Joe Frazier, and some of them were pretty strong. Joe Frazier, despite many attempts of Muhammad Ali to apologize years later, didn't accept it. It's understood. I mean, it's easy for people to say you're bitter or, it's over with, move on. But when you use some of the words that was used at Joe Frazier, some of them sting for the longest time, especially when you talk about this type of rivalry. That's why the rivalry wound up the way it was, and that's why this rivalry was as great as it was. And it's always going to be the gold standard because Ali basically told the words Ali used toward Frazier. Frazier basically said in an HBO show, the only way this rivalry is going to end is when Ali is dead before I was. That's the only way I'm going to end this rivalry. That tells you still how much those words stung Joe Frazier to the day he passed in 2011. That's all you need to know about how much of a hatred these two had for one another, especially from the Joe Frazier angle, who still didn't get over some of the taunts and some of the things that Ali said. Now, as I said earlier, he was a guy that went to bat for Muhammad Ali when Muhammad Ali was in exile, and we know what the reasons were. And Joe Frazier supported him. Just maybe the thought of watching his belt go to the waist of Joe Frazier when it was, in his eyes, wrongfully taken away from her, hurt Ali more than anyone thought. And he was looking for a victim. He found it in Joe Frazier. I mean, in the fight game, we know how the fight game goes with build-ups, especially today where it's absolutely clown shows. But some words that are used can go off the wrong way. We all know that. And when it comes to this, and some of the words and the taunts that were used, despite everything that happened, and despite how Joe Frazier had his back during what took place, during whatever happened to Muhammad Ali when he lost his title, for that to happen to Joe Frazier in his eyes, the words that Ali used hurt, and he felt betrayed. Because I'm not going to go to the sensitive field of this because some of you guys can if you want to. But we talk about that particular area and the areas that were crossed. Some things stung, and they stung bad. And that was something that Joe Frazier could never get over for whatever reason. Whatever the reason is, nobody really knows. Granted, a lot of them were some of the words that are probably unforgivable in how they went about it, which of course boiled over to that studio fight prior to the second fight of January of 74. But that's why the rivalry was what it was. And that's what that made that rivalry such a hated and great rivalry. On the edge of your seat, in and out of the ring, wanting more. Because when Ali came back after what he went through to fight Joe Frazier for the first time, that's a fight everyone wanted to see of March 8th, 1971. And of course, we had the rematch 2.5 years after that. And then after Ali regained his title when he beat George Foreman, 50 years ago tonight at the Philippines, in front of many, many eyes watching this historic event, the conclusion of arguably the greatest rivalry in all of pop culture, not just boxing and sports, but possibly pop culture, ended with Muhammad Ali retaining his title in a brutal 14-round fight with Joe Frazier in a trilogy where the two guys were just made for one another in and out of the ring, however you want to dice it up. And that's what made this rivalry the gold standard forever and ever and ever. Nothing would ever come close. You can coin the phrase rivalry all you want. Everyone will always link Ali-Frazier as the gold standard of rivalries. There's no other way to describe it. Because that's what this was. We're not going to have rivalries like this again because there's too many people. You're always seeing, smiles and smiles laughing in the middle of games and fights. I get the respect card, and I'm sure there's an insurmountable respect between these two combatants. We talk about Ali and Frazier, but when it comes down to winning time, competition time, that needs to go out the window. That's why Ali-Frazier was such a terrific, terrific rivalry. And that's what made him stand out among the best. Probably the best. Because everywhere you walk, not just with the sports community, even all of entertainment and all of pop culture, when you talk about find me a historic clash, a historical rivalry, basically number one almost across the board is, was, and always will be Ali-Frazier. May God rest the souls of both. Ali-Frazier 4 is probably at the pearly gates right now with a star-studded audience, and they're probably still just jabber-jawing away at one another, building that one up. They're just made for one another. And that'll wrap up this edition of Sirhan on X. For those that missed this show tonight or others in the past, you can catch up on the Apple Podcasts, the Spotify app, as well as the iHeartRadio apps, especially the iHeartRadio over here in Cincinnati, which one of the feelings is over here catching onto it. And as always, make self-care your number one priority in all walks of life. If you take care of yourself first, all the good things will come your way. Always focus on you. That's the only thing that matters. If you don't take care of yourself first, nothing else matters. Focus on you, take care of you, and all the good things will come. Have a good rest of the night. Take care of yourselves. God bless. Enjoy the evening, and I'll see you tomorrow night.